What's up, nerds? Y'all ready to get to work? Today we will be getting our hands dirty with the 1954 Glasspar G2, which might look a teeny bit different from when we first introduced it, and that's simply due to the fact that the body is suspended in the air. Yes, we removed the exoskeleton, but we are not stopping there. You see, we're gonna make like vultures and pick this thing down to the bone. After a couple discussions with the owner, we figured why not take it down to square one and start fresh at the frame. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the frame as far as corrosion, rust, or damage, but we sure can clean it up, make it look nice, and protect it even further from corrosion. Before starting the complete disassembly, there are a couple things that are essential to this job. A couple tote boxes, some Ziplocs, and of course, coffee, thanks to our friend Mike. I don't know if that was a joke. I don't know if that was the bit. Thank you anyway. I'm gonna put the name up here because I'm not gonna say it. I want, shout out to Mike H for the coffee, Mike H. Anyway, I think we should start off with the wiring. If you guys saw the previous videos, you will know how hectic the wiring situation was, but it never caught fire, so it can't be that bad. From bundles of wire that aren't connected to anything, to bus bars that are abandoned, harness connectors that don't connect to anything. There are some pretty interesting things about the original builder. This is one of them. Although this cluster of wires may look a mess, it is an organized mess. Every single wire in here is tagged and labeled. Everything from the underdash all the way to the headlight wiring and some engine wiring. There's not a doubt in my mind that that man knew exactly what he was doing. It might look a mess, but the car never caught on fire. And just to give you a glimpse of John, the original builder's mind, check this out. This was in the car. And look, it is a complete logbook dating back to more than a decade of oil, mileage, MPGs, service records. This is exactly how you keep records for airplanes. Nothing says test pilot like keeping an aviation style maintenance log for your car. All right, so we got quite a bit done. The dash is pretty much disconnected from all of the wiring, but here's a pretty important point. Even though this car is going to receive a completely new wiring harness, we are not just blindly cutting and throwing away wires. Instead, we are removing the wires one by one, tracing them back to whatever they go to. For example, the tachometer gauge, we trace the wires all the way back to the distributor in order to have all of the wires just in case we want to reuse this tack. Same goes for everything else. Some of these gauges are vintage, cannot be purchased anymore, so we are salvaging it the best way we can. Also, just in case these indicator lights want to be reused again, we also mark these. This is alternator, high beam, and turn signal. On the other side, we have another turn signal as well as a brake fluid warning light. And here's a really good reason why we are tracing the wires rather than cutting them just to discard them. See this little guy right here? That is a voltage reducer, which will convert 12 volts into 6 volts. Why is that important? We have to note what it is that's receiving the 6 volts, which we traced back to the wiper motor, as well as the lower voltage meter. So if I were to just start disconnecting everything like crazy just to get it over with, by the time we go to reassemble this car and I hook that wiper motor to a 12 volt source instead of a 6 volt source, either we're gonna have super rapid wipers or we're just gonna fry the motor. And that's why it's important to know where all of these wires are going before we start blindly ripping everything out. So I don't wanna go ruining parts that I probably will never be able to find. Another thing that is super interesting that I have not seen before, this switch under the dash is no regular toggle switch because it moves 3 different ways. And what's even more interesting is that it's connected to this water temp gauge, but it's not measuring water. Instead, one of those positions is going to make that gauge read the differential temperature, and the next one is going to be the transmission fluid temperature. Have you, in your life, while you're day-to-day driving, ever thought about your differential fluid temp or your transmission fluid temp? Didn't think so. Unless you're doing some endurance racing, I doubt you would ever need that. I mean, with the logbook we saw earlier, it is no surprise that John was collecting all of this information. I mean, we even have a manifold pressure gauge. Anyway, that's just one of the many interesting things about this build, but let's get back to work. right, so we found something pretty important under the dash. These HVAC controls that I assume primarily controlled the heat were connected to absolutely nothing, so that whole system was completely in-off. The temp control knob leads all the way to this little box, which looks to be a heater valve, but if we look on the other side of that, it is completely disconnected. If we follow the line for the center defroster knob, we end up finding that it's not hooked up to anything either. If we follow the most right air knob, it also leads to an unconnected end, but what's even more interesting is that this looks to be some sort of fresh air mechanism. If we take a look on the other side, we can open this hatch. This is a cool looking thing. It almost looks like old aviation stuff, but this no longer opens. It looks like it was blocked off with what looks to be the bottom of a coffee can or a big can of soup. So those HVAC controls either have to come out completely or we have to retrofit it into whatever components we install in the future. All right, I ran into something that I am completely stumped on. I have no idea what this is. This little knob right here is connected to this metal rod right here, which looks to be connected to some sort of spring-loaded mechanism, a button maybe of some sort. And within that mechanism, there's two harnesses with about 8 or 9 wires. So, not too sure there. If any of you guys know what that is or have a good guess, go ahead and leave it down below in the comments. The only functional heater control is this one right here, which opens the fresh air vent. We are about ready to pull the dash, but there's just one thing I wanted to show you guys. If you guys remember from the previous videos, we had mentioned that this car can be flat towed, which just means you can tow it flat on all 4 wheels without the engine or transmission blowing up. And the way that this car does it is with a drive shaft disconnect. So if I pull on this little lever down here, which is hooked up to this linkage right here, and you can see the disconnect mechanism right there. At the moment, it is not disconnecting. You could probably use some adjustment, but yeah, you guys get the gist. There is a pattern that I've noticed within the wiring. There are a couple of these bus bars throughout the electrical system. You usually only see about 1 or 2 of them per car used to distribute power, but John also used it to distribute ground. This entire bus bar right here is to distribute grounds, as well as this one, and look at the jumps used for this bus bar. All right, enough messing around. Let's take this dash off. So as you guys know, with older cars, some things won't go back on the same way that they came off. This is one of them. So this U-bolt holding the instrument cluster onto this rail was a U-bolt before in the past, but both of the legs, when they were first tightened, have gone their separate ways. Also nowadays, you will see custom instrument clusters like this one, usually made out of aluminum, but this one's made out of plywood, as is the Firewall. So with those 2 pieces bent like that, it won't just push out. Let's see if Kinetics can help us again. You can now see what I was talking about with the U-bolt kind of being distorted. It should come off if everything went fine. Ah, yeah. Nice. It looks kind of cool sitting up there like that. Anyway, the car is starting to look pretty empty now. The owner, Robert, had a really good idea, and it is that we should weigh all of the old wiring once it is out. Now that is something I'm very curious about, but another interesting thing about this car is this piece right here. It is what looks like to be a shim made out of aluminum. This is what the body was sitting on, but only the driver's side had this style shim. The passenger side did not. And what's even more interesting is that once you turn it around, it says outside as if it's supposed to be pointing this way, but when we disassembled the car, the outside was inside. All right, so I just kind of went ham and started cutting all of the zip ties that I could see. In order to separate the bundles on bundles of wire that they were, while keeping them intact. You can see how much cleaner it looks now compared to before. Now we're only left with 3 bundles. We have this main bundle that's coming out of that fuse box. This one right here goes to the rear of the car, and this one's for the steering column, as well as 1 bundle for the engine instruments. And we also undid a bunch of this spaghetti in order to trace those wires back. Also, while I was here, another thing to note is that the e-brake is this braided line down here, and if we trace it back, you'll find that it's not connected to anything. Also, a big duh moment. Other than the frame and the suspension, this car is primarily made out of fiberglass and plywood. So duh, these grounding bus bars were absolutely necessary because you don't really have a lot of options in terms of ground. Compared to, say, the scraps thing, you could pretty much use every inch of this car as a ground if needed. Alrighty, so we have the engine wiring harness undone. So the fuse box sitting right here is now completely disconnected from the car. Also, check this out. The wires going to the voltmeter down there are secured with staples. That's pretty interesting. Do you think they use the stapler like this? Or like this? Or like this? Anyway, let's see what we can do about this fuse box. Yeah, it's just one giant plug. Nice, nice, nice. Look at that. That came out way easier than I expected. Luckily, it was a plug style harness, so we were able to keep it intact. We have the engine area over here, firewall, and dash and the rest of the body. Also, check this out. The accelerator pedal is held on by a bungee cord attached to a screw, attached to another screw. It might be a little flaccid, but still works. All right, so we ran into our first issue, if you want to call it that. While removing all the stuff from the steering column, I noticed that the upper portion was rotating independently from the bottom portion, and once I slid this collar downwards, it revealed that the steering column was completely cracked and separated, but I assume it was caused from the years of getting in and out of the car and using the steering wheel as leverage. I don't see a good way that we can repair that. That wall is pretty thin, so we might have to refab something or replace. Also, this whole time I've been nervous about removing the steering wheel because it is pretty vintage, and this little piece right here is very rare. Nice. All right, now the scary part is over. We can remove the steering wheel. Yo, can you hold the camera straight? Huh? Oh, CC, you got it, boss. Damn. Oh, nice. And right here you can see what I meant by the top portion of the steering column was spinning freely from the bottom. Look at that, there's a small woodruff keeping the spring mechanism intact. Will the rest of it come out like that though? Nice. Damn, look how barren it looks now. It's all empty. Where's the wiring? Where did it all go? We are at about that point where this firewall needs to come out. I hadn't used an impact just yet, because sometimes the impact can cause more trouble than it's worth, but we have a big bolt and a nut on the backside, so let's go at it. Whoa, 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 whoa. Timber should pop out. Oh, a giant steering shaft in the way. No worries, I got an ideas. Oh, dun 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 dun. Oh yeah, baby. Look at this. The the firewall is primarily just made up of plywood. It does have an aluminum sheet towards the rear, probably reinforcement. But yeah, primarily just plywood. But yeah, look at that, guys. It's barren now. It's empty. I told you we were gonna make like vultures and pick this thing down to the bone. This thing had decades of dust that will now give me allergies for the rest of my life. But if we take a closer look at the structure of this car, we will see some hidden notes. I'm assuming most of this stuff is assembly notes in order to be able to put this back together. Hopefully that'll make it easier for us once we do reinstall everything. Also, this is kind of random, but the overflow tank that's just been kind of floating around here is from a Volvo. But before we go crazy with the wrenches and start removing this powertrain, there's a really important thing we gotta do. As we've said before, we are likely swapping out this little V6 for something a tad bigger, as well as a manual transmission. But before we take this one out and make permanent changes, we have to take a couple measurements, like the engine angle and the engine angle in relation to the frame, the distance from the engine to the firewall, engine height in relation to the frame. Might as well measure it with the filter on. Boss, pregunta, ¿para qué medir si va a ser motor y transmisión diferente? That's actually a great question. You see, this car was designed to work with these previously determined angles. If we were to install the new engine a couple degrees too high or too low, it will also change the angle of the transmission. All of that would work its way down, stress the U-joints on the drive shaft as well as the pinion on the differential. Only a couple degrees off can and will be catastrophic to something in the drivetrain. As far as engine height goes, we also want roughly the same that we currently have. If we bolt the new engine down too high, we will have some hood clearance issues, and if we bolt it too low, then we will have some other clearance issues as well as a change in the drive shaft angle. And if you're still curious on how all these angles and measurements work together, go watch the scrap stain videos where we fabricated the engine mounts transmission crossmember and repurged the differential in order to achieve the correct pinion angle. All right, undoing the transmission as well as the remaining pieces in there was easily the worst part of this. I'm no stranger to getting grease and dirt under my fingernails, but doesn't mean I'm a fan of it. The exhaust manifolds are now out as well as the complete exhaust. Check this out though, you can see how custom this exhaust was. See all the cuts and welds, but the engine and transmission are pretty much ready to yank out of there. We just need some motor mount bolts and up she goes. Well, it's time for the biggest piece of the puzzle to come out. All right, so if we did everything correctly, this should pop out. Oh God, it's peeing. It's peeing so much. We should be disconnected from the drive shaft already. Stop peeing everywhere, man. Look at that, she's out. You can see all the blood that was spilled. It was doing that already, but tilting it kind of just spewed it all out. Alrighty, engine is out and sitting on a pallet. I do believe this engine and transmission has already been promised to somebody, so that's why we put it on a pallet. If only we had somebody to clean this mess up for us. Wait, yo? Yeah, you. You got it, boss. 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 Boss! What? We're done. Alrighty, folks, check that out. We are basically completely stripped on this car. We still have a little bit of wiring and a little bit of accessories back here, but for the most part, we're left with this giant skateboard. Also, check out this little Easter egg we found. Built by Post Body Works. This is kind of cool to find buried under everything. I assume that's the name of the chassis builder. If you guys remember from the previous videos, this car was delivered as a kit, so the frame itself was not built by John. Anyway, let's move our disassembly on south. There are a lot of cool things about this car, but I think this is the coolest part. What's cooler than a beer keg as your fuel tank? Not much. Before I disconnect any of the fuel lines, I am gonna tip it on its side because it has a little bit of fuel. It's pretty empty, but it has a little bit. So, now with it tilted on its side, it's not gonna spill all over me once I disconnect this fuel line. Oh yeah, party anyone? All right, so I've gone a little bit crazy and just started removing everything I could see. Rear section is pretty much done. All the wiring is out, all 10 pounds of the wiring that was back here. I left fuel lines and brake lines just because they are pre-bent. Depending on how far we go, we might reuse them, we might remake them. I also went ahead and removed the drive shaft, and speaking of which, we can now see the mechanism that disconnects the drive shaft. As you can see, it has two little jaws right here that will pull on the coupler and use this little bracket right here as a pivot. And also looking down into the transmission tunnel, you can see that there was a couple shims on the bottom of the transmission mount. I assume that those shims were used in order to achieve the right pinion angle. Now it's time to do what I've been saving for last, the steering box. I was saving it for last because it's all ooey gooey and nasty. Then we got this nut down here the size of Texas. Look at that, it's like the size of my palm almost. Ooey gooey. Don't worry, the doctor's in the house. Oh, that hurt, that hurt. There's decades of crud and grease. There's hairs in this grease. There's a cotter pin somewhere in here. All right, so we finally got that steering rod out, but check this out. In order to reach the nut on the steering rod, we had to remove this motor mount bracket, but it's weird because the driver's side engine mount bracket gets bolted on with these large bolts that go through the frame, but the passenger side is completely welded on. I just love those small details that add a little bit of curiosity into this build. Okay, back to the ooey gooey. Using a punch to push out the bolt so we don't damage the threads. The ooey gooey should be free. Might as well just embrace it. Ew. Nice. Oh yeah, look at that, guys. We are left with just the skelly. What used to be a Glasspar is now a rolling frame, but this is exactly what we want. The plan is to clean this frame the best we can. That way we can start off fresh, start off with a clean slate. There is talks of possibly sandblasting this entire frame. Talk about weight reduction. I told you guys we were gonna make like vultures and pick this thing down to the bone. Also, before I forget, somebody sent us this big ass box. It's almost as big as my Curiosity. What are we looking at here? Help me out, guys. Oh my God, I love you guys because I swear on my life, I was thinking about this all day today. You guys are freaking sick. A gift for you. Hey Angel, in your last video I saw you using your foot to hold the bench grinder still while using it. This will not do. Here is a stand for your grinder so at least your feet will be safe. Enjoy, from Brian Brown. Brian, you suspiciously sent us something that was only in my thoughts. All jokes aside, thank you very much because I definitely needed it. Guys, this little grinder has been with us since the first Mustang we have ever built when I was 13 years old, more than a decade ago. When I used to build my cars outside, this thing would get rained on the daily on the monsoon seasons, and she still kicks. Again, this is going to help us start off with a clean slate in order to give this car another couple decades of life. Shall I be bold enough and say century? I don't know, but what I do know is that we made a hell of a lot of progress in a short period of time. This leaves us at a really good stopping point. So, with that being said, thank you guys for hanging out. We'll see you on the next one.